Inside the walls of Topkapi Palace, Istanbul, the year is close to 1600, and a boy no older than 12 stands in a marble corridor, waiting to learn what he has become. He does not yet speak Turkish, does not know the name of the Sultan he now serves, and does not know that the journey to this hallway has already taken something from him he can never recover. His skin marks him as a stranger here, brought from thousands of miles south, across deserts and seas, sold and resold until he arrived at the gates of the most secretive palace on earth. Somewhere beyond these walls live hundreds of women who belong in law and custom entirely to one man, the Ottoman Sultan. This boy has been chosen to guard them, to walk among them, to know their secrets, and to never, under any circumstance, become a threat to the bloodline he protects. To guarantee that, something has already been done to his body that most men would call a death sentence. He survived the procedure that killed the majority of boys subjected to it, and for that, the palace considers him fortunate. He will spend the rest of his life in silk robes, standing guard over the most powerful women in the empire without ever being permitted to touch, marry, or father a child of his own. He will hold more secrets and more danger than almost anyone else inside these walls. This is the story of the Ottoman Harem Guard, and why surviving the honor was often the easy part. Long before this boy ever saw the domes of Istanbul, his fate had already been decided by raiders, merchants, and a trade network stretching across the Horn of Africa. Most of these boys came from Ethiopia and Sudan, regions the Ottomans referred to broadly and dismissively as the source of the empire's black eunuchs. Some were captured in raids on their villages, torn from families who never learned what became of them. Others were purchased outright from slave markets in places like Aswan or the Sudanese interior, bought and sold like livestock at a fraction of the price of a horse. From there, the boys were marched or shipped north toward Egypt, toward a fate almost none of them had been told about in advance. Egypt was where the transformation happened, and it was not performed by Ottoman officials, but by Coptic Christian monks who had built a grim specialization in this one particular surgery. The monks operated out of monasteries near towns like Abu Gharba on the island of Philae, using tools that were crude even by the standards of the era. There were two versions of the procedure, and the difference between them was, quite literally, a matter of life and death. The first was a partial castration, removing the testicles but leaving other tissue intact, a version with a somewhat higher survival rate. The second, reserved for the eunuchs destined to guard the harem itself, was complete removal of all genitalia, performed to eliminate any possibility of sexual contact whatsoever. Historical accounts describe the wound being cauterized with hot oil or packed with ash to stop the bleeding, with no anesthesia beyond, at best, opium. The boys were then buried up to their necks in hot sand, or made to lie still for days, while their bodies fought infection with nothing resembling modern medicine to help them. A tube of tin or reed was often inserted to keep the urinary passage from closing as the wound scarred shut. The mortality rate for the complete procedure is estimated by historians at somewhere between 60 and 90%. That means for every 10 boys who went under the monk's blade, as few as 1 or 2 might walk away alive. The survivors were not celebrated for surviving. They were simply considered a successful batch, ready for the next leg of the journey. European travelers who documented the trade were horrified by what they witnessed, describing rows of recovering boys, many of whom did not recover at all. The bodies of those who died were often discarded without ceremony, an accepted cost of producing palace staff. The ones who lived were transported onward to Istanbul, arriving as commodities with a specific, singular purpose already assigned to them. By the time they reached Topkapi Palace, these boys had already survived the worst statistical odds many soldiers on a battlefield would ever face, and their service had not yet even begun. What waited for them inside the palace walls was not the fantasy of Orientalist paintings, but something closer to a fortress within a fortress. The harem was not a pleasure garden. It was the private, residential and political quarter of the Ottoman dynasty, sealed off from the outside world by high walls and locked gates. At its peak, the harem of Topkapi Palace housed between 300 and 800 women, depending on the era and the sultan. Among them were royal concubines, legal wives when they existed, servants, slaves, and attendants organized into a rigid internal hierarchy. At the very top of that hierarchy stood the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, arguably the single most powerful woman in the entire Ottoman Empire. During what historians call the Sultanate of Women, roughly from the mid-16th to mid-17th century, Valide sultans like Kösem Sultan effectively ran the empire's affairs from behind these walls. This was not a soft, decorative world. It was a nerve centre of imperial politics, inheritance struggles, and international diplomacy. Alliances were built here, sultans were raised here, and more than once the successor to the Ottoman throne was decided here. Sultan Süleyman the Magnificent's relationship with Harem, Sultan, a former concubine who became his legal wife, reshaped Ottoman succession politics for generations. Guarding this space required men who could never be suspected of political ambition through marriage, never father a rival claimant, and never be swayed by intimacy into betraying the dynasty. That is precisely why the eunuch guard existed. A man stripped of the biological capacity to found a rival bloodline, yet still physically imposing enough to enforce order. The guards, drawn from those East African boys, became known collectively as the Black Eunuchs, distinct from the white eunuchs who guarded other parts of the palace and were castrated differently, often only partially. Their job was total surveillance, watching entrances, watching corridors, watching the women themselves, and reporting anything unusual directly up the chain of command. They had unmatched physical access to the Sultan's most private domain, able to walk where almost no other man in the empire, save the Sultan himself, was permitted to walk. And yet that access came bundled with absolute personal powerlessness. They possessed information but no freedom, proximity but no agency of their own. Every door they were trusted to guard was also a door they themselves could never truly walk through as free men. The harem, in other words, was less a den of indulgence and more the beating, administrative heart of an empire that spanned 3 continents. And the men chosen to protect it lived suspended between enormous responsibility and total subjugation. Their loyalty was tested constantly because the stakes inside those walls, quite literally, decided who would rule the Ottoman Empire next. It is that tension between immense trust and immense captivity that defined every single day of a harem guard's existence. A typical shift for a harem guard could stretch 16 hours or longer, standing at fixed posts along the labyrinth of corridors that connected the harem's chambers. There was no comfortable barracks waiting for them at the end of the day. Many guards slept in narrow alcoves or directly in the corridors they were assigned to watch. Sleep itself became a liability because dozing at a post could be interpreted as dereliction of a sacred duty, punishable by beating, demotion, or worse. These men were, in effect, permanently on call, expected to mediate disputes between rival concubines and their households at a moment's notice. Some of those disputes were not petty squabbles, but calculated political maneuvers, factions of women vying to see whose son would be the next sultan. A guard caught favouring the wrong faction, even accidentally, could find his own life forfeit for a mistake he barely understood he had made. Physical punishment for failure was routine and severe, ranging from beatings with rods to imprisonment, with almost no due process to appeal to. The irony was suffocating. These men lived surrounded day and night by some of the most powerful and, by contemporary accounts, most beautiful women in the empire, and were permitted no relationship with any of them whatsoever. Desire itself became a kind of forbidden ghost in their daily existence, present in proximity, but permanently unreachable in practice. Chronic health problems followed nearly all of them, a direct biological consequence of the castration performed on their bodies as children. Without testosterone production, many eunuchs developed osteoporosis, brittle and elongated bones, and unusually high, sometimes disfiguring, physical stature in adulthood. Chronic urinary infections were common, a lasting complication of the crude surgical methods used by the Coptic monks who had performed the procedure years earlier. Fatigue, joint pain and depression were widespread, though the palace kept no formal record of what we would now call their mental health. A 17th century European visitor to Istanbul, the French traveller Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, described the eunuchs of the Seraglio as men living lives of constant vigilance, writing that they were, in his words, as jealous of one another as they are watchful over the women. Tavernier's account, along with those of other European travellers, permitted glimpses of palace life, portrays men trapped in an atmosphere thick with suspicion, where even fellow guards could not be fully trusted. There was no retirement in any meaningful sense. A guard served until he was reassigned, promoted, disgraced or died, whichever came first. Meals were taken in shifts. Hygiene was difficult to maintain given the hours, and access to outside medical care beyond the palace's own physicians was essentially non-existent. Even communication with the outside world, letters, family visits, any contact with the life they had been taken from, was tightly restricted or forbidden outright. For most of these men, the palace became the entirety of their known universe, a walled world with its own laws, hierarchies, and dangers. And within that walled world, there was one route, and only one, towards something resembling real power. That route led to the position of Kizlar Agha, literally the chief of the girls, formerly titled the Chief Black Eunuch, the supreme commander of the Harem's guard. From the late 16th century onward, the Kizlar Agha ranked among the most powerful officials in the entire Ottoman government, often outranking senior pashas and generals. He controlled access to the Sultan's mother and to the Sultan's children, meaning virtually no message, gift, or petition reached the innermost royal family without passing through him first. He also oversaw the immense religious endowments tied to Mecca and Medina, giving him direct influence over Ottoman religious administration far beyond the palace walls. Some Kizlar Aghas accumulated staggering personal wealth, owning property, commanding household staffs of their own, and wielding patronage networks that reached across the empire. The most famous of them, a man named El-Hajj Bashir Agha, served for nearly 30 years in the early 18th century and became one of the wealthiest, most politically influential men the empire had ever produced. But proximity to absolute power came bundled with absolute exposure to danger, because in the Ottoman court, the eunuch's fate rose and fell with the sultan he served. When Sultan Ibrahim I, sometimes remembered by the epithet Ibrahim the Mad, was deposed in 1648, amid a palace coup driven partly by Harem intrigue, the purges that followed swept away allies close to him, eunuchs included. A new sultan often meant a new Valide Sultan, and a new Valide Sultan often meant the old Kizlar Agha's swift removal, exile or execution. Under the volatile reign of Murad III in the late 16th century, palace factions maneuvered constantly for influence over the harem, and eunuch officials were frequently caught in the crossfire of court intrigue they had helped create. Execution could come suddenly, without trial, ordered on suspicion of disloyalty, or simply as a political convenience for whichever faction had just seized the upper hand. Strangulation with a silk cord, the traditional method reserved for high officials of the Ottoman court, was not an unusual end for a Kizlar Agha who had fallen from favour. This was the cage of gilded captivity, enormous wealth, enormous influence, and an ever-present possibility of sudden violent removal from all of it. Even the most powerful eunuch in the empire could never build a rival dynasty, could never pass his fortune to a son, and could never fully escape his origin as another man's property. His achievements, however extraordinary, existed entirely at the pleasure of a court that had created him precisely so that he could never claim independent power of his own. Compare that to a general or a grand vizier, men who at least in theory could found families, dynasties and legacies that outlived them. The eunuch's legacy, by design, died with him, no matter how high he climbed inside the palace hierarchy. It was power without a future, influence without inheritance, a peak with no descendants standing at the summit behind him. And that permanent absence of legacy shaped something deeper than politics. It shaped how these men were forced to understand who they even were. Because before any of them wielded influence over sultans, each one had first been made to disappear as a person. Upon arrival at the palace, boys were typically given new names, Ottoman and Islamic in form, erasing whatever name their families had once called them. Nearly all were forcibly converted to Islam, severing the last formal tie to whatever religious tradition they had been raised in back home. Contact with family was almost universally permanent in its loss. Letters rarely travelled the distance from Istanbul, back to villages in Ethiopia or Sudan, and fewer still received replies. Many of these men would live 60, 70 years inside the Ottoman court system without ever again hearing their birth name spoken aloud by someone who had known them as a child. The psychological weight of that erasure is difficult to overstate. An entire identity dismantled before the age of puberty, and replaced with one assigned by strangers. Beyond the identity loss, the medical toll compounded across a lifetime. Hormone deficiency contributing to depression, chronic pain, and a documented tendency toward earlier onset of certain age-related illnesses. Palace physicians of the era had no real framework for treating what modern medicine would recognize as hormonal deficiency syndrome, so most eunuchs simply lived with the consequences, untreated, for decades. Some historians studying skeletal remains believed to belong to Ottoman-era eunuchs have found evidence consistent with severe, long-term osteoporosis, a silent, invisible cost paid every single day of their working lives. And yet remarkably, community formed anyway, in the only place it could, among the eunuchs themselves. Black eunuchs developed their own internal hierarchy, mentorship traditions, and even informal fraternities, passing guidance from senior officials down to newly arrived boys. Some maintained lifelong loyalties to the men who had trained them, forming something like found family inside an institution explicitly designed to strip family away. A few used their unique position, literate, multilingual, deeply informed about court politics, to become patrons of scholarship, funding schools, and religious institutions bearing their own chosen names. It was, in its own bleak way, a form of quiet resistance. Men denied a bloodline finding ways to leave a mark on the world regardless. But resistance did not undo the fundamental arithmetic of their existence. Extracted as children, mutilated for palace policy, and rebuilt from the ground up into instruments of a system that would never fully consider them free. Their story rarely appears in the romanticized paintings and popular imagination of the exotic Ottoman court that circulated across 19th century Europe. Those paintings depicted languid pleasure gardens and veiled women lounging in luxury, a fantasy largely invented by artists who had never set foot inside Topkapi Palace at all. The reality behind those closed doors was a system of trafficking, surgical mutilation, forced conversion, and lifelong captivity, wrapped in silk and gold to make it palatable to those who benefited from it. Even the language used to describe these men, servants, guards, officials, obscured the brutal mechanism of trafficking and coercion that had produced them in the first place. Strip away the ornate titles, and what remains is a system built on the abduction and mutilation of children for the comfort and security of the powerful. That is the story too rarely told beneath the domes and tilework that tourists photograph in Istanbul today. That system, in its essential shape, has not vanished from the modern world, it has simply changed its costume. Today, an estimated 27 million people live in conditions the United Nations classifies as modern slavery, including forced labor and human trafficking that moves children across borders for the benefit of people who will never see their faces. Domestic workers, trafficked into wealthy households, laborers stripped of passports and freedom of movement, children sold into servitude, in industries the public rarely examines closely. The mechanism persists, even as the palace walls have disappeared. The vulnerable are still extracted from poorer regions to serve the comfort, security, and status of the powerful, and the world still finds ways to look away from how that comfort is produced. Every gilded institution in history has depended on hidden labor most people preferred not to think about too closely. The Ottoman court simply made that dependency visible, if you knew where and dared to look, somewhere inside every luxury economy, past or present. There is a version of that boy standing in the marble corridor, waiting to learn what has been decided for him. History rarely asks whether he consented, it only records what he endured. The Ottoman Harem guard was given proximity to unimaginable power and denied every ordinary freedom a human being could want. A name, a family, a body left whole, a future of his own choosing. He guarded the most powerful women in an empire, yet remained until the day he died someone else's property. And that contradiction, more than any painted fantasy of silk and perfume, is the true history of the Ottoman harem.